The fluorescent lights in room 204 flickered the same way they had for 3 months, casting that sickly yellow glow over worn desks and peeling motivational posters. I was 28 years old, sitting in a community college Spanish class, surrounded by 18-year-olds who treated me like some ancient relic. But I wasn't there for them. I wasn't there for the language either, really. I was there because everything else in my life had crumbled, and learning to say hola felt like the only thing I could still control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she had this way of rolling her R's that made even the simplest words sound like poetry. 50 years old, maybe 52, with silver threads weaving through dark hair, she kept pulled back in a simple bun. She wore reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain, and when she smiled, which wasn't often in those early weeks, tiny lines appeared at the corners of her eyes like delicate sketches. I never expected to fall for my teacher. Hell, I never expected to fall for anyone again. The morning I decided to enroll in Spanish classes, I was sitting in my pickup truck outside the unemployment office, staring at a rejection letter from yet another construction company. The paper was damp from my coffee-stained fingers, and the words blurred together like everything else in my life had been doing for the past 8 months. We regret to inform you that we have decided to pursue other candidates. Other candidates. Younger candidates. Candidates who hadn't spent the last 15 years working for Morrison Construction before the company went belly up, taking my pension and my confidence with it. Candidates who didn't have gaps in their employment history because they'd been too proud to take lesser jobs. My name is Jake Sullivan, and at 28, I felt ancient. The truck's radio crackled with static, some talk show host ranting about economic recovery while I counted the bills in my wallet. $43. That was it. That was all that stood between me and complete financial collapse. The rent on my studio apartment was due in 5 days, and Mrs. Chin, my landlord, had already given me 2 extensions. Her patience was wearing thin, and so was mine. I thought about calling my brother Danny in Phoenix. He'd offered me a job at his auto shop 6 months ago, back when I still had some fight left in me. But accepting would mean admitting defeat, acknowledging that the life I'd built here in Sacramento was truly over. It would mean leaving behind the city where I'd met Sarah, where we'd planned our future, where I'd imagined growing old. Sarah, even thinking her name felt like pressing on a bruise. She'd left 4 months after I lost my job, right around the time our savings account hit zero and the credit card bills started piling up like autumn leaves. "I can't do this anymore, Jake," she'd said, standing in our kitchen with 2 suitcases and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. "I need stability. I need someone who has their life together." I'd wanted to argue, to tell her that losing Morrison wasn't my fault, that the whole construction industry had taken a hit, that I was trying. But the words stuck in my throat like a concrete mix, because deep down, I knew she was right. I was drowning, and I was dragging her down with me. After she left, I'd moved from our shared apartment to the studio on 10th Street. It was a come down from our 2-bedroom place with the view of the American River, but it was what I could afford, barely. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Chun's television through the floor, and the refrigerator hummed with a mechanical wheeze that kept me awake at night. But it wasn't the noise that kept me awake. It was the silence. I'd never realized how quiet my own thoughts could be when there was no one around to share them with. Sarah used to fill the spaces between words with her laughter, her plans for weekend trips we'd never take, her dreams of the house we'd never buy. Without her constant chatter, my world had shrunk to the size of that studio apartment, 400 square feet of regret and instant ramen. The unemployment checks had stopped coming 3 weeks ago. I'd burned through my final extension, and the woman behind the counter at the office had looked at me with a mixture of pity and bureaucratic fatigue when she delivered the news. "Have you considered going back to school?" she'd asked, sliding a pamphlet across the counter. "There are programs for displaced workers, retraining opportunities." I'd stuffed the pamphlet in my back pocket and forgotten about it until this morning, when I'd found it crumpled at the bottom of my laundry basket. The cover showed smiling faces of success stories, people who'd reinvented themselves after losing everything. A 45-year-old former factory worker who became a nurse. A 30-something retail manager who learned computer programming. A construction foreman who discovered a passion for teaching. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sacramento Community College offered evening classes for working adults, though I was neither working nor, increasingly, feeling much like an adult. The course catalog read like a menu of possibilities I'd never considered: accounting, healthcare administration, computer repair, culinary arts. But it was the language section that caught my attention. Spanish 101, beginning conversational Spanish. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 6:30 to 8 p.m. Instructor, E. Vasquez. I'd taken 2 years of Spanish in high school, back when I thought I might join the Peace Corps, or travel the world, or do any of the 1,000 things that 18-year-olds dream about before reality sets in. I'd been decent at it too. Good. Enough to help translate for the Mexican crew members at Morrison when language barriers caused problems on job sites. Maybe that was what drew me to the idea. The memory of being useful, of bridging gaps between people who needed to understand each other. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I could still learn something new, that my brain hadn't atrophied along with my bank account. The registration fee was $85. Money I didn't have for a class I didn't need to take a language I'd probably never use. But as I sat in that truck, staring at the unemployment office where I'd just been told there were no more safety nets left, it felt like the most reasonable thing in the world. I walked into the community college that afternoon wearing my least wrinkled shirt and carrying a checkbook that I prayed wouldn't bounce. The financial aid office was a maze of forms and requirements, but the woman behind the desk, Mrs. Rodriguez, according to her nameplate, took one look at my situation and pointed me toward emergency assistance programs I'd never heard of. "You qualify for a hardship waiver," she said, stamping my registration form with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd done this countless times before. "Books are extra, but there's a lending library if you can't afford them." I couldn't afford them. By the time I left the college, I was officially enrolled in Spanish 101, Introduction to Psychology, and Basic Computer Skills. 3 classes that cost me nothing but pride, which I'd discovered was a currency I could no longer afford to hoard. That night, I called Danny. "About time," he said when I told him about the classes. "You were starting to sound like a ghost in our phone calls." I felt like one. Dad always said the Sullivans are too stubborn to stay down for long. Maybe this is your way back up. Our father had been a carpenter, like his father before him. He'd built half the houses in our neighborhood in Stockton, working with his hands, until arthritis forced him into retirement. He'd died when I was 25, just before Sarah and I got serious, and I'd always wondered what advice he would have given me about losing Morrison. Whether he would have understood my decision to go back to school instead of just finding another construction job. "Jake?" Danny's voice pulled me back to the present. "Yeah, I'm here. You're going to be okay. You know that, right?" I wanted to believe him. Sitting in my empty studio apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer fit, I wanted to believe that taking 3 classes at a community college was the first step toward something better. But belief felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. "I hope so," I said instead. The first day of classes was a Tuesday in late September. I arrived at Sacramento Community College 30 minutes early, mostly because I had nowhere else to be, and partly because I wanted to avoid the rush of students who actually belonged there. The campus was larger than I'd expected, a sprawling collection of brick buildings, Connected by walkways lined with struggling palm trees, room 204 was in the liberal arts building, second floor, down a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and unfulfilled potential. I found a desk in the back corner, the kind of spot I'd favored in high school when I wanted to remain invisible. The other students filtered in gradually, mostly young faces that made me feel ancient, a few adults closer to my age who looked as uncertain as I felt. At exactly 6:30, she walked in. Elena Vasquez moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of commanding attention without demanding it. She was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'4", wearing a navy blue cardigan over dark slacks and sensible shoes that suggested she spent a lot of time on her feet. Her hair was pulled back in that simple bun, a few silver strands catching the harsh fluorescent light, and when she set her materials on the desk at the front of the room, her movements were precise and economical. "Buenas noches, Clays," she said, and even those two words carried an authority that made the scattered conversations die instantly. "Good evening, class. I am Señora Vasquez, and for the next 16 weeks, this room will be your gateway to the Spanish-speaking world." Her voice carried just a trace of an accent, enough to add musicality to her words without making them difficult to understand. She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote her name on the blackboard in neat, careful letters. "Before we begin, I want you to understand something," she continued, turning back to face us. "Learning a language is not about memorizing vocabulary words or conjugating verbs, though you will do plenty of both. It is about opening your mind to new ways of thinking, new ways of expressing yourself, new ways of connecting with other human beings." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, and for a moment, I felt like she was speaking directly to me. Some of you are here because you need language credits for transfer. Some because your jobs require it. Some because you've always wanted to travel to Spain or Mexico or South America. All of these are good reasons. But I hope that by the end of our time together, you'll discover that the best reason to learn Spanish or any language is simply this: it makes you more human. A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Will this class be hard?" Señora Vasquez smiled, and those tiny lines appeared at the corners of her eyes. "Hard? Yes. Impossible? No. The difference between those two things is practice, patience, and a willingness to make mistakes." She moved to the whiteboard and drew a simple diagram, a circle with arrows pointing outward. "Your comfort zone," she explained. "Everything you've ever learned has required you to step outside of it. Walking, reading, driving a car, falling in love, all of these things were once foreign to you. Spanish will be foreign too, at first. But if you trust the process, if you trust me, and most importantly, if you trust yourself, you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish." For the next hour and 20 minutes, she led us through basic introductions, pronunciation exercises, and simple greetings. She had each of us stand and introduce ourselves in Spanish, helping with pronunciation and offering gentle corrections when we stumbled. When my turn came, I stood on unsteady legs and managed, "Me llamo Jake. Tengo 28 años." "Muy bien, Jake," she said, and something in her tone made the compliment feel genuine rather than perfunctory. "Your pronunciation is quite good. Have you studied Spanish before?" "A little, in high school." "Ah, then welcome back to the language. Sometimes the second time around, we appreciate things we missed the first time." There was something in the way she said it that made me wonder if she was talking about more than just Spanish. After class, I lingered as the other students filed out, pretending to organize my notebook while I watched her pack her materials. She moved with the same careful precision she displayed during the lesson, each item finding its proper place in a well-worn leather satchel. "Jake?" Her voice startled me from my observation. "Yes, ma'am?" You seemed very focused tonight. That's good. Focus will serve you well in this class. She paused, studying my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. Are you planning to continue with Spanish after this semester? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought beyond getting through the next 16 weeks, let alone planning for future semesters. I'm not sure. I guess it depends on how well I do. It depends on how much you enjoy it, she corrected gently. Grades are important, but enjoyment, that's what sustains us through the difficult parts. She finished packing her satchel and headed toward the door, then turned back. Jake, if you don't mind me asking, what brought you back to school? The honest answer was too complicated, too raw to share with someone I'd just met. So I gave her the simple version. Lost my job. Figured it was time to try something new. She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than I'd actually said. Sometimes life gives us gifts disguised as setbacks. Perhaps learning Spanish will be one of those gifts for you. Then she was gone, leaving me alone in room 204 with the lingering scent of her perfume, something floral and understated, and the strange feeling that our conversation had meant more to her than it should have. I walked to my truck in the gathering darkness, past groups of students heading to evening jobs or late dinners, and realized that for the first time in months, I was looking forward to something. Not just the next class, but the possibility that Señora Vasquez might be right about gifts disguised as setbacks. That night, I practiced conjugating the verb ser, to be, until I fell asleep with my notebook open on my chest and Spanish words dancing through my dreams. Thursday evening arrived with an October chill that cut through my second-hand jacket as I walked across campus. 2 days had passed since my first Spanish class, and I'd found myself thinking about Señora Vasquez's words more than I cared to admit. Sometimes life gives us gifts disguised as setbacks. The phrase had rattled around in my head while I submitted job applications online and microwaved another dinner of canned soup. I arrived at room 204 15 minutes early again, but this time I chose a seat in the middle row instead of hiding in the back corner. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I was tired of being invisible. The other students trickled in with the casual confidence of people who belonged somewhere, chatting about weekend plans and upcoming exams in other classes. Señora Vasquez entered precisely at 6:30, carrying the same leather satchel and wearing a burgundy sweater that complemented her dark hair, but something was different tonight. She moved more slowly, and when she set her materials on the desk, I noticed her hands trembling slightly. Buenas noches, Clays, she began, but her voice lacked the commanding presence from Tuesday. Tonight we'll be working on present tense conjugations and basic sentence structure. She turned to write on the blackboard, and that's when I saw a small bandage on the back of her left hand, and what looked like the edge of a larger bandage peeking out from beneath her sleeve. When she reached up to write Los Verbos Regulares across the top of the board, she winced almost imperceptibly. The lesson proceeded normally for the first hour. We worked through conjugation patterns, practiced forming simple sentences, and listened to her demonstrate proper pronunciation. But I found myself watching her more carefully, noticing the way she favored her left arm, how she occasionally paused mid-sentence as if gathering strength. During our 10-minute break, most students stepped out into the hallway or checked their phones. I remained at my desk, pretending to review my notes while keeping an eye on Señora Vasquez. She sat heavily in her chair and rolled up her sleeve slightly, revealing what was definitely medical gauze wrapped around her forearm. When she caught me looking, our eyes met for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "Everything all right, Jake?" she asked, quickly pulling her sleeve back down. The question hung in the air between us. I could have said yes, minded my own business, maintained the appropriate student-teacher boundary. Instead, something in her expression, vulnerability masked by professional composure, made me speak honestly. "I was going to ask you the same thing." She studied my face, seeming to weigh whether to deflect or confide. Finally, she said, "Minor medical procedure this morning. Nothing serious, but the anesthesia is taking longer to wear off than expected. Are you sure you should be teaching tonight?" A small smile crossed her lips. "Are you sure you should be worrying about your professor's health instead of focusing on your conjugations?" "Probably not," I admitted. "But my mother raised me to notice when people aren't feeling well." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. "Cancer took her when I was 22. The words slipped out before I could stop them. I rarely talked about my mother's death, especially not with near strangers. But something about Senora Vasquez's gentle attention made confession feel natural. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. And unlike the hollow condolences I'd grown accustomed to, her sympathy felt genuine. Was she sick for a long 3 years? Breast cancer. She fought it hard, but I shrugged, unable to finish the sentence. "Fighting doesn't always guarantee victory," she said softly. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply endure." The other students began filtering back into the classroom, ending our conversation. But for the remainder of class, I felt a subtle shift in the dynamic between us. She called on me more frequently, offering encouraging nods when I answered correctly and patient corrections when I stumbled. When class ended, she asked me to stay behind. "Your homework for tonight," she said, handing me a worksheet. "But also this." She pulled a small Spanish-English dictionary from her satchel. "It's an extra copy. I thought you might find it useful." I accepted the dictionary, surprised by its weight and the care with which she'd obviously maintained it. The cover was worn but clean, the pages marked with tiny pencil notations in the margins. "Thank you, but I can't afford. It's not for sale," she interrupted. "It's a loan. Return it when you no longer need it." "When will that be?" "When Spanish feels like home instead of a foreign country." I flipped through the pages, noting her careful annotations. "How long did it take you to feel at home with it?" "I was born in El Salvador," she said, gathering her materials. "Spanish was my first language. But English took me 15 years to truly master. Not the grammar or vocabulary, but the nuances. The way Americans say, 'How are you?' without really wanting an answer. The difference between politeness and genuine care. Which category do I fall into?" She paused in her packing, considering the question seriously. "Tonight, genuine care. Thank you for noticing that I wasn't at my best. Thank you for trusting me enough to mention it." We walked out of the building together, an awkward silence settling between us as we navigated the transition from classroom to parking lot. Her car was a modest Honda Civic, at least 10 years old, but meticulously maintained. Mine was the pickup truck with the dented tailgate and the radio that only worked on AM stations. "Jake," she said as we reached the point where our paths would diverge, "would you mind if I asked you something personal?" "Go ahead." "Earlier, you mentioned your mother raised you to notice when people aren't feeling well. What would she think of your decision to come back to school?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on surviving each day that I hadn't considered how my mother might view my current situation. She'd been a practical woman, a nurse who worked double shifts to support us after my father left when I was 12. Education had been sacred to her, even though she'd never had the chance to pursue much of it herself. "She'd probably say I was being stubborn," I said finally. "She always said I was too proud for my own good. But she'd also say that learning something new is never a waste of time, even if you can't see the purpose yet." Wise woman indeed. "What about you?" I found myself asking. "How long have you been teaching?" 12 years at the community college. Before that, I taught high school for 8 years. She unlocked her car door but didn't get in. "I fell into teaching accidentally, the way most good things happen." "What were you doing before?" "Translation work, mostly legal documents. Dry, precise, no room for creativity or connection. Then A friend asked me to substitute for her Spanish class just for one day, and I discovered something I didn't know I was looking for, which was the moment when a student's face lights up because they suddenly understand something that seemed impossible 5 minutes earlier. That moment when language stops being foreign and starts being communication. Standing in the parking lot under the yellow glow of security lights, talking about language and learning with my Spanish teacher, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the pleasure of real conversation. Not the surface-level exchanges I had with potential employers, or the careful politeness I maintained with my landlord, but genuine human connection. "I should let you get home," I said, suddenly aware that we'd been talking for 20 minutes after class ended. "Yes, I suppose you should." But she made no move toward her car. "Jake, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem older than 28. Bad year," I said simply. "Or maybe you're just someone who thinks deeply about things. That's not always a burden, you know." In language learning, students who overthink often make the most progress once they learn to trust their instincts. And how do you learn to trust your instincts? Practice making mistakes. Discovering that most errors aren't fatal. She opened her car door. "See you Tuesday? I'll be here." "Good. And Jake?" "Don't spend the weekend worrying about conjugations. Spend it listening to Spanish music, watching Spanish movies with subtitles, letting the rhythm of the language wash over you. Understanding comes before perfection." I watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the October darkness, and realized I was smiling for the first time all day. When I got home to my studio apartment, I didn't immediately flip on the television or heat up dinner. Instead, I sat at my small kitchen table with the Spanish dictionary she'd loaned me and began looking up words I didn't need to know. Esperanza, hope, courage, nuevo comienzo, new beginning. The weekend passed differently than usual. Instead of scrolling through job postings with increasing desperation, I found myself following Señora Vasquez's advice. I discovered a Spanish radio station that played everything from mariachi to modern pop, letting the unfamiliar words flow over me while I cleaned my apartment. I checked out Spanish movies from the library, like Water for Chocolate, The Motorcycle Diaries, and watched them with English subtitles, trying to catch familiar words and phrases. By Sunday evening, I realized I was looking forward to Tuesday's class with an anticipation that had nothing to do with academic requirements and everything to do with seeing Señora Vasquez again. Tuesday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Northern California weather that makes everything feel hushed and introspective. I arrived at room 204 with 5 minutes to spare, carrying the Spanish dictionary in my backpack along with a notebook I'd filled with new vocabulary words over the weekend. Señora Vasquez entered at 6:30 sharp, and I was relieved to see that. She moved with her usual confidence. The bandage was gone from her hand, though I noticed she still favored her left arm slightly. She wore a forest green cardigan over black slacks, and her hair was pulled back in a slightly looser bun that allowed a few strands to frame her face. "Buenas noches, Clays," she began, then switched to English. "I hope you all had a relaxing weekend. Tonight we're going to try something different. Instead of starting with grammar, we're going to begin with conversation." A nervous murmur rippled through the classroom. Conversation felt ambitious for students who'd only had 2 lessons. "Don't worry," she said, noting our apprehension. "We're going to start very simply. I want each of you to tell the class one thing you did this weekend. But you must say it in Spanish. Use whatever vocabulary you know, supplement with gestures if necessary, and don't worry about perfect grammar. Communication is the goal, not perfection." She started with the front row, giving each student time to formulate their response. "A young woman named Jessica managed yo trabajo and restaurante. A middle-aged man named Robert struggled through yo mir y acute television mucho. Each attempt was met with encouraging nods and gentle corrections. When she reached me, I stood and took a breath. Est fin de semana, escuche musica española y mayor películas con subtítulos. También, estudié palabras nuevas en el diccionario. The classroom fell silent. I was surprised by how naturally the words flowed. Excelente, Jake, Senora Vasquez said, and I heard genuine admiration in her voice. Your pronunciation has improved dramatically since Thursday. What music did you listen to? Jesse and Joy, I said, naming one of the artists I'd discovered on the radio. Juan Manu Chao. Ah, excellent choices. Both artists use very clear pronunciation. Music is one of the best ways to develop an ear for language. She paused, studying my face. You followed my weekend advice. Yes, ma'am. It was enjoyable. What was the most surprising thing you discovered? I considered the question carefully. How much I could understand without knowing every word. Context, contexto. Helped fill in the gaps. Precisely. You're learning to trust your linguistic instincts. That's advanced thinking for someone in their second week. After class, she asked me to stay behind again. This time, however, she seemed less like a teacher addressing a student and more like someone with something personal to share. Jake, I owe you an apology, she began, organizing her papers with unnecessary precision. Thursday night I should have canceled class. I wasn't at my best, and my students deserved better. You seemed fine to me. You were kind to say so, but we both know that wasn't true. She looked up from her papers. I had a small procedure done Thursday morning. Nothing serious, but it left me more shaken than I expected. Are you okay now? Physically, yes. Emotionally. She trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. My doctor found some irregularities during my annual exam. Nothing cancerous, thankfully, but it required a biopsy. The waiting, the uncertainty, it brought back memories I thought I'd processed years ago. I waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. My husband died of cancer 8 years ago. She continued, pancreatic. When Dr. Martinez said she needed to run additional tests, for a moment I was right back in that oncology waiting room, holding Rafaela's hand while we waited for results that would change everything. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. That must have been terrifying. It was. But do you know what helped me get through it? Focusing on something immediate and constructive. Teaching, preparing lessons. Thinking about how to help my students discover the beauty of language instead of dwelling on medical possibilities I couldn't control. Is that why you seemed different Thursday night? Because you were trying to distract yourself? Partly. But also because you reminded me of Raphael in that moment, the way you noticed I wasn't well without making a big production of it. He had that same quiet attentiveness. Standing in the empty classroom, fluorescent lights humming overhead, I felt the weight of her trust. She was sharing something deeply personal, crossing the invisible line between teacher and student that neither of us had acknowledged until now. Thank you for telling me, I said. And for what it's worth, I think your husband would be proud of how you handled a difficult situation. You still showed up, still taught us, still cared about whether we learned something. Even though I was distracted and favoring my left arm, especially because of that. It showed us that commitment means showing up even when you don't feel like it. That's a lesson worth learning in any language. She smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from her. You know, Jake, for someone who claims to be struggling with his life, you have remarkable insight into what matters. Maybe that's what happens when you lose everything. I said, you start noticing the things that actually have value. And what have you noticed has value? I thought about the question as we walked toward the parking lot together. Kindness, patience, people who see you as more than your current circumstances. I paused. Teachers who loan dictionaries to students who can't afford them. Students who worry about their teacher's well-being, she countered. We'd reached her car again, and the same comfortable awkwardness from Thursday settled between us. But this time, instead of an extended conversation about language and learning, we stood in companionable silence for a moment. "Jake," she said, "finally, would you be interested in some extra practice? With Spanish? With conversation? I have office hours on Wednesdays from 4 to 6. Most students use that time for makeup exams or grade disputes. But if you wanted to practice speaking, purely for educational purposes, you'd be welcome to stop by." The offer hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and perfectly innocent in its academic framing. "I'd like that," I said. "Where's your office?" "Liberal Arts Building, 3rd floor, room 310. But Jake?" She unlocked her car door. "This stays between us. I don't offer conversational practice to all my students." "Why me?" "Because you remind me that teaching isn't just about grammar and vocabulary. Sometimes it's about helping someone discover they're capable of more than they imagined." As I watched her drive away for the second time, I realized that somewhere between Thursday's medical scare and tonight's personal revelations, Elena Vasquez had stopped being just my Spanish teacher. I wasn't sure what she was becoming, but I knew I wanted to find out. Wednesday afternoon found me standing outside the Liberal Arts Building, checking my watch for the third time in 5 minutes. It was 4:15 p.m., and I'd been debating whether to go to Elena's office hours since I woke up that morning. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was just academic tutoring, but another part, a part I'd thought Sarah had permanently damaged, whispered that something more significant was beginning. The elevator to the 3rd floor groaned with the mechanical fatigue of a building that had seen better decades. Room 310 was at the end of a narrow hallway lined with office doors, bearing nameplate after nameplate of professors I'd never heard of. Dr. Chun, philosophy. Professor Martinez, political science. And there, at the very end, E. Vasquez, modern languages. I knocked softly, half hoping she wouldn't hear me and I could retreat with my dignity intact. "Come in," came her voice from the other side. Elena's office was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, but every inch had been carefully arranged to create an atmosphere of warmth and learning. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, packed with Spanish literature, language textbooks, and what appeared to be a collection of Latin American poetry. A small window overlooked the campus quad, where students were scattered on benches enjoying the October sunshine. Her desk was organized but lived in, with stacks of papers to grade, a ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Teacher," and a small photograph I couldn't quite see from the doorway. "Jake," she said, looking up from the essay she'd been reviewing. "I wasn't certain you'd come. Honestly, neither was I." I stepped into the office, immediately aware of how the small space seemed to amplify our proximity. I kept telling myself it was just extra study time, and now I'm wondering if I'm kidding myself about why I'm here. The honesty surprised us both. Elena set down her red pen and gestured to the single chair across from her desk, a comfortable-looking armchair that had probably been salvaged from someone's living room. "Sit," she said, "and let's start with why you think you're here." I settled into the chair, which was indeed as comfortable as it looked. The official reason? I want to improve my conversational Spanish. And the unofficial reason? I enjoy talking with you. Not just about Spanish, about everything. I haven't had a real conversation with someone in months. She nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this admission. I invited you here because I enjoy talking with you too. The question is, what do we do with that enjoyment? What do you mean? I mean that I'm your professor, you're my student, and there are ethical boundaries that exist for good reasons. She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. But I also mean that I'm 50 years old, you're 28, and we're both adults capable of making thoughtful decisions about friendship. Friendship, I repeated, testing the word. Is that what you'd call this? I considered the question carefully. What had developed between us felt more complex than friendship, but less defined than romance. It was a connection, pure and simple, two people who'd found something valuable in each other's company. I'd call it a possibility, I said finally. Possibility for what? I don't know yet, and maybe that's okay. She smiled, reaching for a thermos on her desk. Would you like some coffee? I made extra, and it's actually good today. You make coffee? In your office? I make coffee everywhere. It's a Salvadoran trait. We believe proper coffee is a basic human right. She poured the dark liquid into two mismatched mugs, handing me one that read Sacramento Community College. Excellence in education. The coffee was indeed excellent, rich and strong, with a hint of cinnamon that lingered on the tongue. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and I found myself studying the photograph on her desk. It showed a man with kind eyes and graying temples, his arm around a younger version of Elena. Both were laughing at something beyond the camera's view. That's Raphael, she said, noticing my gaze. Taken about a year before he got sick. He looks happy. He was, even during the worst of it, he found reasons to smile. He used to say that laughter was his form of rebellion against cancer. How long were you married? 23 years. We met when I was 25, fresh out of graduate school, and convinced I knew everything about everything. She picked up the photograph, tracing the edge with her finger. He was 32. A social worker who spoke terrible Spanish, but was determined to learn it so he could better serve his clients. I was his tutor. The parallel wasn't lost on either of us. Did you know immediately that he was special? I asked. No, in fact, I thought he was hopeless at languages. His pronunciation was atrocious, his grammar was worse, and he had this habit of translating everything literally from English. She laughed softly, but he never gave up. Every week he'd come to our sessions with new questions, new words he'd encountered, new ways he'd tried to practice. His persistence was attractive. What changed? When did tutoring become something more? The night he brought me horchata from this little restaurant downtown. He'd been practicing ordering in Spanish all week, he said, and wanted to share his success with someone who'd appreciate it. We sat in my graduate student apartment, drinking horchata and talking about everything except Spanish. That's when I realized I looked forward to our sessions, not because I enjoyed teaching, but because I enjoyed him. I sipped my coffee, processing the story and its implications. Are you telling me this as a cautionary tale or as encouragement? I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what's happening between us isn't unprecedented in my life, but it also isn't something I take lightly. She set the photograph back in its place. Raphael was my student before he was my husband, but the transition from one to the other happened naturally, honestly, and with complete respect for both of our autonomy. And you think something similar might be happening with us? I think we're two people who found an unexpected connection at a time when we both needed it. I think you're old enough and wise enough to know the difference between attraction and genuine compatibility. And I think I'm experienced enough to navigate the complexities of a relationship that begins in an academic setting. She paused, meeting my eyes directly. But I also think we need to be very careful about how we proceed. What does careful look like? It looks like continuing to meet here in my office under the perfectly legitimate guise of language tutoring. It looks like getting to know each other as people, not just as teacher and student. It looks like taking time to understand what we're feeling before we act on those feelings. And if what we're feeling turns out to be more than friendship, then we deal with that honestly and responsibly when the semester ends. The timeline felt both reasonable and impossibly distant. 8 more weeks of Tuesday and Thursday classes. 8 more weeks of maintaining professional boundaries while exploring personal ones during these Wednesday afternoon conversations. I can work with that, I said. Good, now shall we actually practice some Spanish, or will people start to suspect our tutoring sessions are just elaborate coffee dates? For the next hour, we worked through conversational exercises that felt nothing like the structured lessons of our regular classes. She asked me to describe my ideal vacation in Spanish, and I stumbled through descriptions of mountains and small towns where nobody knew my name. I asked her to tell me about El Salvador, and she painted vivid pictures of coffee farms and volcanic lakes, her words flowing between English and Spanish as her emotions guided the narrative. Mi país es hermoso pero complicado, she said, describing the civil war that had driven her family to emigrate when she was 16. Beautiful but complicated. Like most things worth loving, is that why you became a Spanish teacher? To help people understand your culture? Partly. But also because language is a bridge, Jake. When you learn someone's language, you learn how they think, how they see the world. English taught me to be direct, efficient, practical. Spanish keeps me connected to passion, family, the importance of taking time to really taste your food. What has learning Spanish taught me so far? She considered the question seriously. That you're capable of more vulnerability than you allow yourself in English. In Spanish, you can't hide behind complicated vocabulary or familiar phrases. You have to communicate with your whole self, gestures, expressions, emotional honesty. Is that good or bad? For you, very good. You've been hiding behind competence for so long that you've forgotten how attractive authenticity can be. The observation hit deeper than I expected. Sarah had often complained that I was too reserved, too careful with my emotions. You never just react to anything, she'd said during one of our final arguments. Everything has to be thought through, analyzed, controlled. Raphael used to tell me something, Elena continued, seeming to sense my introspection. He said that Americans are terrified of looking foolish, so they never allow themselves to be beginners at anything. But beginners get to be amazed by simple things, understanding a joke in another language, successfully ordering coffee, having someone smile when you mispronounce their name but try anyway. I used to be good at being a beginner, I said. Before everything fell apart, I was always starting new projects, learning new skills. Sarah said it was one of the things she liked about me at first. What changed? Failure. When Morrison went under, when I couldn't find another job, when Sarah left suddenly, being a beginner at anything felt dangerous. Like I couldn't afford to not be good at something immediately. And now? Now I'm sitting in my Spanish teacher's office drinking excellent coffee and realizing that maybe failure isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. Maybe the worst thing is letting failure stop you from trying new things. Elena smiled, and I noticed again those small lines at the corners of her eyes, not signs of age, but evidence of a life that had included enough joy to create permanent smile marks. Jake, can I ask you something personal? Shoot. What do you want? Not what you think you should want, not what would be practical or safe or logical. What do you actually want? The question hung between us like a challenge. I'd spent so many months focused on survival, finding work, paying rent, avoiding complete financial collapse, that I'd forgotten that wanting was even an option. I want to feel useful again, I said slowly. I want to wake up looking forward to something. I want to have conversations that matter with someone who sees me as more than my current circumstances. And romantically, what do you want there? The directness of the question should have made me uncomfortable, but instead, it felt liberating to be asked so honestly. I want to stop being afraid that caring about someone will end in disappointment. I want to trust that someone can know all my messy details and still choose to stick around. Have you told anyone else these things? No, not even myself really, until just now. Then this conversation has been worthwhile regardless of where it leads. We were interrupted by a knock on the door. Elena called, "Come in," and a young woman peered around the doorframe, one of our classmates from Spanish 101. "Oh, sorry, Señora Vasquez. I didn't know you had someone with you. I can come back later." "It's fine, Jessica." Jake and I were just finishing up his conversation practice. What can I help you with? I wanted to ask about the midterm exam. I'm really struggling with the subjunctive mood. I stood to leave, but Alina caught my eye. Same time next week? She asked, and I heard layers of meaning in the simple question. Absolutely, I said. Thank you for the extra help. Walking back to my truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not just for next Wednesday's conversation, but for the possibility that Elena was right about beginners getting to be amazed by simple things. Maybe learning Spanish was teaching me more than verb conjugations. Maybe it was teaching me how to be open to wonder again. That evening, I called Danny in Phoenix. You sound different, he said after we'd covered the usual topics: his business, the weather, our mutual avoidance of serious subjects. Different how? Like you're not just surviving anymore. Like maybe you're actually living a little. Maybe. I am. Good. Dad always said the Sullivans do their best work when they're building something new instead of trying to fix what's broken. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with Elena's dictionary and looked up a word I'd heard her use but hadn't understood. Esperanza. Hope. I wrote it carefully in my notebook, along with the pronunciation guide, and realized that for the first time in months, the word felt like more than just vocabulary. It felt like a possibility. 3 weeks into our Wednesday afternoon meetings, the rhythm had become natural. I'd arrive at Elena's office at 4:15. We'd spend the first 15 minutes catching up over coffee, then dive into Spanish conversation that meandered between grammar lessons and personal stories. By week 4, I was dreaming in Spanish and thinking about Elena far more than any student should think about their professor. It was during our 5th Wednesday session that everything shifted. I was describing my weekend job search in Spanish. Busque trabio en tres sitios diferentes. Paro nadi. Mi llamó, when Elena's office door opened without warning. A tall, severe-looking woman in her 60s stood in the doorway, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun that made Elena's loose style seem rebellious by comparison. Elena, the woman said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that stops conversations. Dead. I need to speak with you. Elena straightened in her chair, and I watched her transform from the warm, engaging woman I'd been talking with into something more guarded. Dr. Patterson, of course. Jake, perhaps we should continue this next week. But Dr. Patterson made no move to step aside for my exit. Instead, she studied me with the clinical attention of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about people. Mr. Sullivan, isn't it? She said, and the fact that she knew my name sent a chill down my spine. You've been spending quite a bit of time in Professor Vasquez's office. I'm getting extra help with Spanish conversation, I said, standing and gathering my notebook. Senora Vasquez has been generous with her time. Indeed she has. Dr. Patterson's tone suggested this generosity was precisely the problem. I'll need to discuss Professor Vasquez's office hour policies with her. Good afternoon, Mr. Sullivan. The dismissal was clear. I caught Elena's eye as I headed for the door, seeing something between embarrassment and defiance in her expression. Next week? I asked quietly. We'll see, she replied, which was the first uncertain thing I'd ever heard her say. I spent the walk to my truck trying to decode the encounter. Dr. Patterson's knowledge of my name and our meetings suggested someone had been paying attention to our Wednesday sessions. The thought that our conversations were being monitored made me feel simultaneously guilty and protective guilty, because maybe we had crossed some invisible line. Protective because Elena didn't deserve to be scrutinized for showing kindness. To a struggling student, Thursday's regular class felt different. Elena maintained perfect professional distance, calling on me no more frequently than other students, offering no encouraging smiles or personal comments. When class ended, she dismissed everyone with a brisk "Hasta el jueves" and began packing her materials with deliberate efficiency. I lingered, pretending to organize my notes while the other students filed out. "Elena," I said when we were alone. "It's Senora Vasquez in the classroom," she corrected, not looking up from her papers. "What happened yesterday?" "Who was that woman?" "Dr. Patterson is the department chair. She received some concerns about my office hours and wanted to address them." "Concerns from whom?" Elena finally looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Fear. Not of Dr. Patterson or departmental consequences, but of something deeper. "Jake, I think we need to take a break from our Wednesday meetings." The words hit me harder than they should have. In the month since we'd started talking, those conversations had become the highlight of my week. More than that, they'd become proof that I was capable of connecting with someone again, that Sarah's departure hadn't permanently damaged my ability to be interesting to another person. Because of what some department chair thinks? Because she's right to be concerned. Elena finished packing her satchel and headed toward the door. "What we've been doing. It's not appropriate. Having coffee and practicing Spanish isn't appropriate." She stopped walking, her back still to me. "You know it's more than that. Is that such a terrible thing?" When she turned around, her expression was pained. "Jake, I'm 50 years old. You're my student. I have a career to protect and a reputation I've spent 12 years building. Whatever this is between us, it's not worth risking everything I've worked for. What if it is worth it?" "You can't know that. We can't know that. We've known each other for 5 weeks." The rational part of my brain understood her position. The emotional part felt like I was losing something precious before I'd even had a chance to fully appreciate it. "So that's it? We pretend the last month didn't happen?" We acknowledge that the last month was a mistaken judgment on my part, and we move forward with appropriate boundaries. She left me standing in the empty classroom, fluorescent lights humming overhead, feeling more alone than I had since Sarah walked out. But this loneliness was different, not the hollow emptiness of abandonment, but the sharp ache of loss mixed with possibility. That weekend, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of wallowing in my studio apartment, I drove to the downtown library and spent Saturday afternoon researching Sacramento Community College's faculty policies. What I found was a maze of guidelines about professional relationships, conflicts of interest, and appropriate boundaries, but nothing explicitly prohibiting friendships between faculty and students as long as grades weren't compromised. More importantly, I found Dr. Patterson's background. She'd been at the college for 37 years, had never married, and had built her career on rigid adherence to rules and regulations. 3 different sources mentioned her old-school approach to maintaining academic propriety, which seemed to be code for disapproving of anything that looked like human connection. Sunday evening, I did something I'd never done before. I called the college's main number and asked to speak with Dr. Patterson. "This is highly unusual, Mr. Sullivan," she said when I explained who I was. "Students don't typically request meetings with department chairs. This isn't a typical situation. No, it isn't." "Very well. Monday at 2 p.m. My office is in the administration building, room 150. Monday afternoon I found myself sitting across from Dr. Patterson in an office that felt like a monument to academic bureaucracy. Diplomas covered one wall, policy manuals filled floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and her desk was so organized it looked more like a museum display than a workspace. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, "I assume you're here to discuss Professor Vasquez. I'm here to make sure she doesn't get in trouble for being a good teacher. Good teachers maintain appropriate boundaries with their students. Good teachers also recognize when a student needs extra support and provide it." Dr. Patterson leaned back in her chair, studying me with the same clinical attention she'd shown in Elana's office. "What exactly is your relationship with Professor Vasquez?" "She's been helping me with Spanish conversation during her office hours. Nothing inappropriate has happened." And yet you felt the need to request this meeting to defend her. That suggests your relationship goes beyond typical academic support. I prepared for this question during my weekend research. Dr. Patterson, I'm 28 years old, recently divorced, and struggling to rebuild my life after losing my job. Professor Vasquez has been kind enough to give me extra help, not just with Spanish, but with remembering that I'm capable of learning new things. If kindness and encouragement are inappropriate, then maybe the problem isn't with her behavior. The problem, Mr. Sullivan, is perception. When a female professor spends excessive one-on-one time with a male student, especially one closer to her age, it creates an appearance that compromises her professional standing. Whose perception? Who complained? That's confidential. Was it another student? Another faculty member? Or are you creating problems where none exist? Dr. Patterson's expression hardened. Mr. Sullivan, I've been in education for nearly 4 decades. I've seen promising careers destroyed by poor judgment and inappropriate relationships. Professor Vasquez is a valuable member of our faculty, and I won't allow her to jeopardize her position for a temporary infatuation. What makes you think it's temporary? Because you're grieving your marriage, unemployed, and vulnerable. Professor Vasquez is lonely after losing her husband. Neither of you is in a position to make rational decisions about relationships. The assessment stung because it contained enough truth to feel like an attack, but it also clarified something for me. Dr. Patterson, with all due respect, you don't know either of us well enough to make those judgments. You don't know that Professor Vasquez has helped me regain confidence in my ability to learn and grow. You don't know that our conversations have been the most intellectually engaging part of my week. And you don't know that whatever feelings might be developing between us are based on genuine compatibility, not desperation. And you don't know that pursuing those feelings could cost Professor Vasquez her career. Is that a threat? It's a reality. Community colleges depend on community trust. Parents send their children here believing faculty will maintain professional standards. If that trust is compromised, she didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. What do you want from me? I asked. I want you to transfer to a different Spanish section. Professor Martinez teaches Spanish 101 on Monday and Wednesday evenings. I've already arranged for your transfer. And if I refuse, then I'll have to document this conversation and begin a formal review of Professor Vasquez's conduct. The process would be unpleasant for everyone involved. I sat in silence for a moment, weighing my options. I could fight this, insist on my right to take classes with the professor of my choice, force Elena to navigate a formal investigation. Or I could remove myself from the situation and protect her from consequences that seemed wildly disproportionate to our crime of having meaningful conversations over coffee. If I transfer sections, Professor Vasquez faces no consequences? Correct. And this conversation stays between us? As long as you maintain appropriate boundaries going forward. The decision felt like choosing between my own happiness and Elena's well-being. But when I thought about her face in the classroom last Thursday, the fear I'd seen in her eyes, the choice became clear. I'll transfer, I said. Wise decision, Mr. Sullivan. Professor Martinez is an excellent instructor. You'll find her methods quite different from Professor Vasquez's, but equally effective. Walking out of the administration building, I felt the familiar weight of defeat settling on my shoulders. But this time, the feeling was tempered by something else, the knowledge that I'd made a sacrifice for someone I cared about. It wasn't the romantic gesture I might have imagined, but it felt like the right thing to do. That evening I called the college registrar and confirmed my transfer to Professor Martinez's section. Then I sat down and wrote Elena a letter I would never send, explaining my decision and everything I'd wanted to say but couldn't. Writing it felt like closure, or maybe like preparation for a conversation I hoped we'd have someday when the semester ended and the constraints of academic propriety no longer applied. Wednesday at 4:15. I found myself driving past the liberal arts building instead of parking and heading to Elena's office. Through her third-floor window, I could see the light was on, and I wondered if she was expecting me, if she'd made coffee for 2 people, if she understood why I hadn't come. Thursday evening, I attended my first class with Professor Martinez. She was competent, thorough, and completely unmemorable. The lesson covered the same material Elena would have taught, but without the warmth, the personal anecdotes, the sense that learning Spanish was an adventure rather than an obligation. During break, Jessica approached me. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Senora Vasquez seemed really disappointed when you weren't in class Tuesday." "I transferred sections," I said simply. "Why? Everyone knows you were her best student." I didn't have an answer that wouldn't raise more questions, so I just shrugged and returned to my seat. But Jessica's comment stayed with me. Elena had been disappointed, which meant our conversations had mattered to her too, that I hadn't imagined the connection between us. The thought gave me hope that this forced separation was temporary, that whatever we'd started building could survive a few weeks of institutional interference. But it also made me angry at Dr. Patterson's narrow-minded assumptions, at a system that punished kindness, at the cowardice that had made me choose the safe path instead of fighting for what mattered. That night, I made another decision. I would respect the transfer, finish the semester in Professor Martinez's class, and keep my distance from Elena until academic protocol no longer governed our interactions. But when the semester ended, when grades were submitted and I was no longer her student, I would find her and finish the conversation Dr. Patterson had interrupted, because some connections are worth fighting for, even if you have to wait for the right battlefield. The rain started on a Tuesday in late November. The kind of steady Northern California downpour that turns the world gray and makes everything feel temporary. I was sitting in my truck outside the community college library, watching students hurry between buildings with backpacks held over their heads like inadequate umbrellas. When I saw her, Elena emerged from the liberal arts building carrying a large box, struggling to balance it while opening an umbrella that seemed determined to invert itself in the wind. She'd parked 3 rows away from me, close enough that I could see her frustration as she tried to protect whatever was in the box from the rain. 3 weeks had passed since my transfer to Professor Martinez's class. 3 weeks of competent but uninspiring Spanish lessons. 3 weeks of avoiding the liberal arts building. 3 weeks of wondering if Elena thought I'd simply given up on learning Spanish altogether. But watching her struggle with that box in the rain, all my careful avoidance strategies crumbled. I was out of my truck and jogging toward her before I'd consciously decided to move. "Let me help," I said, reaching for the box just as her umbrella finally surrendered to the wind and turned itself inside out. "Jake." She looked startled, then relieved, then worried in quick succession. "What are you doing here?" "Library research," I said, taking the box from her arms. It was heavier than expected and filled with what felt like books. "What's this?" "Books for the literacy program downtown. I volunteer there on Tuesday evenings." She wrestled her umbrella back into submission, studying my face as if trying to determine whether my appearance was coincidence or design. "I heard you transferred to Professor Martinez's section." "I did." "May I ask why?" We stood in the rain, water dripping from the brim of my baseball cap, and I realized this was the conversation I'd been both dreading and hoping for since my meeting with Dr. Patterson. "Let's get this to your car first," I said, nodding toward the box. "Then we can talk." We hurried across the parking lot, our shoulders bumping as we shared the inadequate protection of her umbrella. When we reached her Honda, she unlocked the trunk and I carefully placed the box inside, arranging it so the books wouldn't slide around during transport. "Thank you," she said, closing the trunk. "You didn't answer my question." The rain drummed on the roof of her car, creating a pocket of relative privacy in the busy parking lot. Other students and faculty rushed past us, focused on their own destinations, paying no attention to a professor and a former student having a conversation beside a gray Honda Civic. I transferred because Dr. Patterson made it clear that our Wednesday meetings were creating problems for you, I said. I thought removing myself from the situation was the best way to protect your career. Elena's expression cycled through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been gratitude mixed with frustration. You met with Dr. Patterson? When? The Monday after she came to your office. I wanted to make sure you wouldn't face any consequences for being kind to a struggling student. What did she say to you? I gave her the abbreviated version: Dr. Patterson's concerns about perception, her threats of formal investigation, the ultimatum that led to my transfer. As I spoke, Elena's face grew increasingly angry, though I could tell the anger wasn't directed at me. She had no right to threaten you, Elena said when I finished, or to force you out of my class. Your academic choices should be yours to make. Maybe. But she was right about one thing: whatever was developing between us could have hurt your career. I couldn't live with that, so you sacrificed your own education to protect me. I sacrificed some Spanish conversation practice to protect someone I care about. Professor Martinez is fine. Boring but competent. Elena laughed despite herself, a sound that mixed humor with exasperation. Jake, you shouldn't have had to make that choice. This whole situation is ridiculous. Is it? Were we just having innocent tutoring sessions? Or was there something more happening? The directness of my question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked away, watching raindrops chase each other down her car window before meeting my eyes. Again, there was something more happening, she admitted quietly. From the very beginning, if I'm being honest. The way you listened, the way you asked questions that showed you were really thinking about what I said. It reminded me of conversations I'd had with Raphael, but it also felt completely new. Then Dr. Patterson wasn't wrong to be concerned. She was wrong to assume that two adults can't navigate complex feelings responsibly. She was wrong to threaten your academic career. And she was wrong to make decisions about our lives based on her own fears and prejudices. A gust of wind sent rain under the umbrella, and we instinctively moved closer to Elena's car, our conversation becoming more intimate by necessity. What do we do now? I asked. I don't know. The semester ends in 3 weeks. You'll no longer be my student, officially, but Dr. Patterson will still be watching for any sign that we're... She trailed off. That we're what? That we're becoming what I think we both know we're becoming. The admission hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and complication. I wanted to reach for her hand, to close the physical distance. That matched the emotional one we'd been navigating for weeks. Instead, I shoved my hands deeper into my jacket pockets. Elena, can I ask you something? Of course. If there were no academic policies, no department chairs, no professional consequences, what would you want? She considered the question for a long moment, rain pattering on the umbrella above us like an impatient audience waiting for her answer. I'd want to continue our conversations. I'd want to cook you dinner and argue about whether Neruda or Lorca was the better poet. I'd want to show you the El Salvador I remember from before the war, and I'd want you to show me the Sacramento you're learning to call home again. She paused. I'd want to find out if what we have is real, or just two lonely people finding comfort in each other's company. And what's stopping you from wanting those things now? Fear, practicality, the knowledge that wanting something doesn't make it wise or possible. What if it is possible? What if we just have to be patient and careful? Patient and careful. How? I'd been thinking about this question since my meeting with Dr. Patterson, turning over possibilities during long evenings in my studio apartment. We wait until the semester ends. Then we start over, not as teacher and student, but as two people who met in a Spanish class and discovered they enjoyed each other's company. And Dr. Patterson? Dr. Patterson can disapprove all she wants, but she can't regulate the personal lives of faculty members once there's no academic relationship involved. Elena studied my face, looking for something sincerity, perhaps, or evidence that I'd really thought this through. Jake, I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for a rebound relationship or someone to help me avoid dealing with grief. If we pursue this, I want it to be because we genuinely believe we could build something lasting together. What makes you think I'm not looking for the same thing? Because you're 28 and rebuilding your entire life. Most people your age want to keep their options open, not commit to a relationship with a 50-year-old widow who comes with complicated history and limited energy for starting over. The concern in her voice was real, and I realized that our age difference wasn't just an external obstacle. It was something she genuinely worried about. Elena, can I tell you what I see when I look at you? She nodded. I see someone who's lived enough to know what matters and what doesn't. Someone who survived real loss and still has the courage to care about new people. Someone who makes excellent coffee and asks questions that make me think differently about everything. I paused. I don't see your age as a limitation. I see it as evidence that you've become someone worth knowing. And I see someone who's just beginning to figure out who he is after everything fell apart. That's not a criticism, Jake, it's an observation. Are you sure you want to figure that out alongside someone else? Or do you need time to discover yourself independently first? The question struck at something I'd been avoiding thinking about. Was I drawn to Elena because she represented stability and wisdom during a chaotic time in my life? Or was this connection based on something deeper than circumstance? I've spent the last 6 months learning who I am when everything I thought I knew about myself gets stripped away. I said slowly. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, more adaptable than I expected, and apparently capable of caring about someone even when it complicates everything. Those discoveries didn't happen in isolation. They happened through conversations with you. So you think I helped you find yourself? I think you helped me remember that finding yourself isn't something you do alone. It's something you do in a relationship with other people who see parts of you that you can't see yourself. Elena smiled, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from her since before Dr. Patterson's intervention. You know, for someone who claims to be rebuilding his life, you have remarkable clarity about what you want. Maybe clarity comes from having everything else stripped away. When you lose your job, your marriage, your sense of who you are, the things that remain feel pretty essential. And I'm one of those essential things. You're the first person in months who's made me feel like myself again. Not the person I was before everything fell apart, but the person I'm becoming. That feels pretty essential. The rain was beginning to lighten, and I could hear car doors slamming as people finished their Tuesday evening classes and headed home. Our conversation was approaching its natural end, but neither of us seemed ready to leave. Jake, if we do this, if we wait until the semester ends and then see where this leads, we have to be completely honest with each other about our expectations. What are your expectations? That we take it slowly, that we don't make any major decisions based on the intensity of having to hide our feelings for 3 weeks. That we give ourselves permission to discover this might not work without feeling like we failed at something. Those seem like reasonable expectations. And yours? That we give this a real chance. That we don't let other people's opinions or concerns about age or propriety stop us from finding out what we could be together. That we trust ourselves to make good decisions about our own lives. Elena nodded slowly. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until the semester ends. Then we start over, as friends first, as whatever feels right. She extended her hand, a formal gesture that felt both serious and slightly absurd, given everything we just shared. Deal. I shook her hand, noting how small and warm it felt in mine, how the simple contact sent electricity up my arm. Deal. I should go, she said, glancing at her watch. The literacy program starts at 7, and I'm already running late. Drive carefully, the roads are slick. I will. She opened her car door, then turned back. Jake? Yeah? Thank you. For protecting my career, for being honest about your feelings, for being willing to wait. Not many 28-year-olds would have handled this situation with such maturity. Not many 50-year-olds would have been worth waiting for. I watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the gray November evening, and realized that the 3 weeks ahead felt less like an obstacle and more like preparation time. Time to finish the semester strong, to continue building the life I wanted in Sacramento, to be certain that what I felt for Elena wasn't just gratitude or loneliness disguised as love. Walking back to my truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced since losing my job at Morrison. Genuine optimism about the future. Not the desperate hope that things would return to how they used to be, but excitement about what they might become. That night, I pulled out the letter I'd written to Elena after my meeting with Dr. Patterson, the one I'd never intended to send. Reading it again, I realized how much had changed in just 3 weeks. The man who'd written that letter had been afraid of losing something precious before he'd had a chance to fully understand it. The man reading it now understood that some things are worth waiting for, especially when the waiting itself becomes part of building something lasting. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer. Maybe someday I'd show it to Elena, evidence of how much this connection had meant to me, even when it seemed impossible. But for now, it could wait. We could wait. 3 weeks had never felt so full of possibility. The last day of finals week arrived with December sunshine that felt like a promise. I'd finished my Spanish exam with Professor Martinez that morning. Competent but forgettable conclusion to a competent but forgettable class. Walking across campus afterward, I felt the weight of completed obligations lifting from my shoulders. No more academic constraints. No more Dr. Patterson's watchful disapproval. No more pretending that Elena Vasquez was just another professor. I found her in the faculty parking lot, loading boxes into her trunk with the same careful precision I'd noticed that rainy Tuesday 3 weeks earlier. But today she moved with purpose rather than struggle, and when she saw me approaching, her smile was immediate and unguarded. "Finished?" she asked, closing her trunk. "Officially graduated from Spanish 101. Again. And how do you feel about that?" "Like, I'm ready for Spanish 102, with the right instructor." Elena laughed, a sound that no longer carried the careful modulation of professional distance. "Are you asking me to be your teacher again?" "I'm asking if you'd like to have dinner tonight, as two people who happen to speak Spanish and enjoy each other's company." "What did you have in mind?" "That little Salvadoran restaurant on K Street." I looked up the menu online and practiced pronouncing everything. I figured it was time I experienced your culture properly. "Jake Sullivan, did you just ask me on a date in Spanish?" "Te gustaría cenar conmigo esta noche?" "Sí, me encantaría." We stood in the parking lot grinning at each other like teenagers. And I realized this was the moment I'd been imagining for 3 weeks. Not dramatic or earth-shattering, just two people finally free to explore what they'd been building in careful increments. 7 o'clock? I asked. "Perfect. I'll meet you there." The restaurant was small and warm, filled with the scent of pupusas and the soft murmur of Spanish conversation. Elena arrived wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual professional bun. She looked younger, more relaxed, like someone who'd set down a burden she'd been carrying for months. "You look beautiful," I said, standing as she approached our table. "You look nervous." "I am nervous. This is my first real date in over a year." "Mine too. Shall we figure it out together?" Over dinner, we talked about everything except Spanish and teaching. Elena told me stories about growing up in El Salvador, about her parents' small coffee farm, and the grandmother who'd taught her to cook. I shared memories of building houses with my father, of the satisfaction that came from creating something solid and lasting with your hands. I got a job offer this week, I said as we shared flan for dessert. Construction? Site supervisor for a restoration company. They specialize in historic buildings downtown. It's not Morrison, but it's work I'd be proud of. That's wonderful. Are you going to take it? I already did. I start Monday. Elena smiled, and I saw genuine happiness in her expression, not just politeness, but real joy at my good news. Jake, that's incredible. You must feel relieved. I feel like myself again. For the first time since everything fell apart, I feel like I know who I am and what I'm doing. And what are you doing? Building a life worth living. Starting with this dinner. 3 months later, Elena and I were regulars at the Salvadoran restaurant, at the Saturday farmers market, at the small theater downtown, where they showed foreign films with subtitles. We moved slowly, deliberately, learning each other's rhythms and habits like students mastering a new language. I met her daughter Lucia when she visited from San Francisco, and was surprised by how easily we connected over shared stories about Elena's stubborn streak and terrible sense of direction. Elena came to the first building I'd supervised the restoration of, wearing a hard hat and asking intelligent questions about load-bearing walls and historical preservation techniques. By spring, I was spending most nights at her house, a small bungalow near Land Park that she'd filled with books and plants and the accumulated treasures of a life fully lived. We cooked together, argued good-naturedly about everything from politics to proper coffee brewing techniques, and fell asleep to the sound of each other's breathing. Do you ever regret it? She asked one evening as we sat on her back porch, watching her garden emerge from winter dormancy. Regret what? Taking Spanish, meeting me, complicating your life with a stubborn 50-year-old professor. Do you regret falling for a confused 28-year-old construction worker? You're not confused anymore. And you're not just my professor anymore. She curled against my side, fitting perfectly in the space between my arm and ribs. What are we then? We're Jake and Elena. We're two people who found each other at exactly the right time, even when it seemed like the wrong time. Te amo, she said softly. I love you too. The words came naturally in both languages, carrying the weight of everything we'd built together through patience, honesty, and the willingness to wait for what mattered. That night, as Elena slept beside me in the house that had become our home, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. From that first evening in room 204, when she'd talked about language making us more human, to this moment of quiet contentment in her bed. She'd been right, of course. Learning Spanish had made me more human, not because of verb conjugations or vocabulary lists, but because it had led me to someone who saw the best parts of who I could become. Someone who taught me that love, like language, is something you learn by practicing it daily, making mistakes, and trusting that understanding comes before perfection. Repeat after me, she'd said that first night. Te amo. I'd repeated the words, not knowing they would become the most important phrase I'd ever learned. Not because she'd kissed me, though she had, that first night at dinner when I'd successfully ordered our entire meal in Spanish, but because those words had led us here, to this life we'd built together, one conversation at a time. In the morning, I would wake up next to the woman I loved, in the house we shared, ready for another day of the life we'd chosen together. But for now, I lay listening to her breathe and feeling grateful for every twist in the path that had brought me to room 204, to Spanish lessons, to Elena. Sometimes the best education happens when you're not even trying to learn anything. Sometimes love speaks every language at once. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.